Welcome. There's an old saying that any book or article whose title is a question can be sufficiently answered with the word no. Therefore, one way to respond to David T. Gordon's A Nation Reformed is to say, nope, I guess not, and move on. However, there's also the more complex answer, which is probably the more interesting answer as well. To start, we'll discuss the events that led up to the publication of A Nation at Risk and the context in which it was written. Then we'll discuss the contents of A Nation at Risk itself. Then we will discuss the reform movements that this publication inspired. And finally, we'll explore some of the major themes of the articles in A Nation Reformed. In the time period before A Nation at Risk was published in 1983, the role of the federal government with regards to education was much different than we tend to think of it today. The government was often involved in ensuring that education was equitable, was accessible to students from all backgrounds. Think of Brown versus the Board of Education, or the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which introduced Title I. All of this legislation was meant to ensure that all children had access to, as the language goes, a free and appropriate public education. There was much less focus on academic achievement, or at least academic achievement for all students. Not all students were expected to be capable of high academic achievements. In the 1970s, things began to change. The role of the federal government in education began to increase. They began to be involved with more than just ensuring equity, but also with promoting achievement. Under President Carter, the other President Carter, there you go. The Department of Education was formally created, giving the federal government a more expansive role in education. President Reagan originally ran on the platform of wanting to demolish the Department of Education, true to his conservative roots. It was under his administration, however, that the National Commission on Excellence in Education was actually formed and brought us A Nation at Risk. They published their findings in 1983. This was arguably the height of the Cold War, and fear about the Soviet Union was rampant in America at this time. This is apparent in some of the alarmist language found in A Nation at Risk. It warns of a rising tide of mediocrity that is engulfing the American public school system. It also plays heavily on the fears of Americans that other countries are giving their children a better education than America was at this time. Whether this was true or not is not really the point. The point is that many Americans perceived it to be true, and to this day, we still perceive it to be true. We might not be afraid that our education is being surpassed by the Soviet Union anymore, but we are afraid that it's being surpassed by countries like China, Japan, South Korea, Finland, Denmark, to name a few. This shows how truly relevant A Nation at Risk is to the educational climate today. It paved the way for all of the reform movements that followed its publication in 1983, including such things as No Child Left Behind and the creation of the Common Core standards. It represented a significant shift in the paradigm of education. Academic achievement is now the main goal. How we measure that achievement has changed over the years, but the fundamental point is the same. Since A Nation at Risk, our country has been concerned with making sure that all students are capable of achieving academically at high levels. Now, to discuss more extensively the content of A Nation at Risk and its direct impact, I turn things over to my partner, Bill.
In the actual essay, A Nation at Risk, we receive more details of exactly what reforms the essay was looking for. This happened to be more school time, more competitive pay, more strenuous and harder requirements, and reforming as means to an end, as in eventually to stop reforming and get to a point where the system seems to work. However, this is easier said than done. Most reforms called for in A Nation at Risk become hard to implement across the board. The one that was the easiest to implement, of course, was having students spend more time in school. This, although it was difficult at first to make resources work for teachers and students, was perhaps the easiest and least time-consuming. Some of the other portions of A Nation at Risk plan were much more difficult and more detailed as well. For example, when it comes to standards and expectations, the essay outlines that, quote, schools, colleges, and universities adopt more rigorous and measurable standards and higher expectations for academic performance and student conduct, and that four-year colleges and universities raise their requirements for admission. This would help students do their best educationally with challenging materials in an environment that supports learning and authentic accomplishment, end quote. They go into detail with certain recommendations such as checking textbooks and making sure that they are, quote, upgraded and updated to assure more rigorous content, end quote. But also making sure that, quote, standard tests of achievement should be administered at transition points of one school to another, to certify the student's credentials, identify the need for remedial intervention, identify the opportunity for advanced or accelerated work, end quote. The essay defines this as something that should be administered through a system of state and local standardized tests. The idea behind this is that it would assist teachers and students to evaluate student progress. When going into teaching, the essay talks about how schools should be looking for teachers that meet, quote, high educational standards and demonstrate an aptitude for teaching and have competence in academic discipline, end quote. The essay also expounds upon making strong contracts and salaries for teachers, having school boards, administrators, and teachers cooperate to create career ladders, and allowing incentives to be made available to strong students so that they may be more involved in the teaching profession. The essay also touches upon leadership and fiscal support, stating that, quote, citizens across the nation hold educators and elected officials responsible for providing the leadership necessary to achieve these reforms, and that citizens provide the fiscal support and stability required to bring about these reforms. They do so basically by expounding upon the fact that education is a community initiative where everyone plays a role. This would later be enacting through different means of reform, such as top-down to bottom-up reform. The rest of the book is a collection of essays of different ideas for reform and how they worked and were enacted. One of the first means of reform was the excellence movement, or the top-down idea. The idea of the excellence focused on making colleges stricter upon accepting teachers and making the requirements for a teacher stronger. As Furman states in our article, the 20-year effort to reform education, quote, they focused on raising standards for students and teachers by, among other things, increasing course requirements for graduation, instituting more student assessment, specifying particular courses deemed important, lengthening the school day or year, and stiffening requirements for teacher certification. Timothy Knowles, in his essay, The Academic Imperative, explains how, quote, institutions must scrutinize the design of their programs and determine the extent to which they are providing a supply of principles equipped to address the academic imperative, end quote. He goes on to say that even if these colleges and universities create a pipeline of good leaders, fundamental changes are required at the school level. The important part, Timothy Knowles says, is about selecting the right leaders and making sure they have control of knowledge of the school district to take the helm. It is about selecting the correct leaders in order to create a more powerful school system. After a couple of years, however, there was a backlash to this movement. The opposing idea was the restructuring movement, also known as the bottom-up movement. Furman describes how this movement, quote, found its way into state policy and frequently shaped district reform programs, end quote. Policymakers bought into the idea that, quote, giving schools more autonomy as long as it was in return for greater results, end quote. The idea was to run schools like a business, where, quote, companies focused on flattening management structures and providing flexibility to a team of workers, end quote. David T. Gordon, in his essay titled The Limits of Ideology, Curriculum and Culture Wars, discusses how teachers should take matters into their own hands. He cites examples from a study of Cohen and Hill that illustrates a, quote, great gap between what was prescribed as policy and what took place in practice, end quote. Cohen and Hill state that, quote, teachers learn things from experience and that reformers, critics, and policymakers can never know because they lack the experience and rarely inquire of teachers, end quote. The idea is, quote, like doctors and lawyers, architects, or other professionals, teachers know what is drawn up on the board rarely translates into practice. After this movement, the entire movement of standards took place. Although the book touches on this briefly, this book culminates in making teachers accountable with the idea of no child left behind. Because this book was published in 2002. One of the last essays seems to be a hope for the future. Schwartz stated that in some school states, the standards are so broad and general that virtually every test can be aligned with their standards. In other states, the standards may be so specific and measurable, but the tests are only designed to meet the low ends of those standards. Schwartz states that, quote, whether No Child Left Behind's one-size-fits-all assessment and accountability requirements will strengthen or sink the movement is an open question. Will the next generation of governors, state education chiefs, and business leaders have the knowledge, commitment, and political skills to keep their state reform programs on course, even if the course conflicts with the requirements of NCLB? Stay tuned.
Even though the different chapters of A Nation Reformed were written by different people, there are still certain common themes that run throughout the book. One of these is that the reform over the past 20 years has not been entirely effective. There's not been that much actual change in the way that students are educated in America, or at least change that shows up in data. One reason for this, according to many of the authors in A Nation Reformed, is that policy and practice have become so separate in education that they basically have no relation to each other. Lawmakers create laws about education, or administrators come up with guidelines that they want their teachers to follow. But in practice, these things are not always followed. Even when they are followed, it may not be 100%. For instance, one of the chapters of A Nation Reformed talks about the movement to introduce whole language instruction as opposed to phonics to teach reading to young children. Many of the schools that nominally adopted whole language reading instruction still had teachers who provided phonics instruction to individual students as needed. When the data came back that children in these schools were making great progress with their reading abilities, it doesn't necessarily mean that the gains were due to whole language. In fact, many studies have shown that it's a combination of whole language and phonics instruction that provides the best reading instruction for young students. In response to this disconnect between policy and practice, David T. Gordon claims that reality must always maintain the upper hand over ideology. educational decisions must be made with respect to real data and the views of real teachers who spend their time working in classrooms with students. Another theme running throughout A Nation Reformed is what seems today like a strange amount of faith in high-stakes testing, such as that exemplified by No Child Left Behind. We must remember that this book was written in 2003. This was only a year after No Child Left Behind was introduced. Since then, opinions about No Child Left Behind have turned overwhelmingly negative, both among the public and among educators themselves. We no longer tend to believe, as did many of the writers of A Nation Reformed, that high-stakes, federally mandated testing and standards-based education are one and the same. We can keep our faith in one and sacrifice the other if it is proven to be ineffective. Finally, there's a great deal of hope in A Nation Reformed. The particularities of that hope differ from author to author. Jeff Howard, for instance, suggests that perhaps the future of education is to be found in alternatives to the standard system, such as charter schools or school vouchers, allowing parents to send their children to private schools under public money. Others would disagree and say that what we need to do is make our public schools good enough that parents aren't trying to find these other options. Underlying all of it, though, is an unshakable belief that the educational system can be improved. It had only been 20 years at the time A Nation Reformed was written that academic achievement had even been considered the main goal of public schools. That is not a lot of time. Even today, it has only been 30 years. It is unrealistic to expect that the complex and multifaceted problems outlined in the original A Nation at Risk document could be solved in merely 30 years of time. What educators need to do now is to always keep in mind their principles, their fundamental beliefs about what education should be, and engage in reform only as a means to that end. Thank you.